The Russian Empire, once the largest realm on Earth, glittered under the weight of its own contradictions. The Romanov dynasty, rulers for over 300 years, stood at the very heart of it, embodying both the splendor and the tragedy of Russia. By the early 20th century, the throne was occupied by Tsar Nicholas II, a man born into unimaginable privilege, yet burdened with unbearable responsibility. The Romanovs lived in palaces, with walls gilded in gold, their meals accompanied by chandeliers of crystal and orchestras playing softly in the background. Outside those palaces, however, a different Russia bled. The peasants were starving. Factories overflowed with exhausted workers who labored long hours for crumbs. Soldiers fought and died in wars that had no end. And still, behind palace gates, Nicholas clung to the old ways, as if the empire had not changed since the days of his ancestors. He was a man more devoted to family and faith than to politics. Yet fate had chosen him to steer a ship already sinking. His wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, the German-born Tsarina, was a woman of deep devotion, consumed by her love for her children and by a desperate secret. Their only son, Alexei, heir to the throne, was fragile, cursed with hemophilia disease that made the slightest wound potentially fatal. Every fall, every bruise, was a shadow of death. This weakness in the air became the family's greatest vulnerability, a chink in the iron armor of empire. Into this wound crept a dark figure, a man who would forever stain the name of the Romanovs, Grigory Rasputin. A wandering mystic from Siberia, Rasputin carried with him the aura of the strange and the dangerous. He was said to heal the boy when doctors could not. He whispered prayers, touched Alexei's body, and the bleeding would cease. To the desperate Tsarina, Rasputin became more than a healer. He was a savior, a holy man sent by God to preserve her son. But to the court, to the nobility, and to the people, he was poison. Rasputin's presence turned the Romanovs into a spectacle of scandal. Rumors spread like wildfire, tales of drunken orgies, of whispered plots, of Alexandra under Rasputin's control. Whether true or exaggerated, these whispers rotted the dynasty from within. To the revolutionaries gathering in the shadows, Rasputin was proof that the monarchy was corrupt beyond redemption. As Russia plunged into the First World War, the empire bled more than ever before. Millions of young men were sent to the front, dying in frozen trenches, their blood soaking into foreign soil. Nicholas, desperate to command his armies with honor, left the capital to oversee the war effort personally. In his absence, Alexandra and Rasputin tightened their grip on power in Petrograd. Ministers came and went like pawns, dismissed at the whim of the Tsarina or the monk. Chaos consumed the government, while famine haunted the streets. In December of 1916, Rasputin's enemies struck. A group of nobles, convinced that killing him would save the empire, lured him to a palace. They poisoned his wine and cakes, shot him, beat him, and finally drowned him beneath the icy waters of the Neva River. Yet the prophecy Rasputin had left behind haunted the Romanovs. If I am killed by common men, you and your children will rule for centuries. But if I am killed by nobles, your entire family will be destroyed within 2 years. The words clung to Alexandra's soul like frost. When Rasputin's corpse was found, his face twisted in defiance, even in death. The curse seemed sealed. The year 1917 arrived like a storm. Hunger riots broke out in Petrograd. Soldiers mutinied, refusing to fire upon the starving crowds. The empire Nicholas ruled with divine certainty crumbled in a matter of weeks. He abdicated in March, not only for himself, but for his son. The dynasty that had stood since 1613 collapsed overnight. For the first time in 3 centuries, Russia was without a Tsar. The Romanovs were placed under guard. At first, they were kept in relative comfort, confined to the Alexander Palace. Nicholas and Alexandra clung to their children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the frail Alexei seeking solace in family prayers, games, and small routines. Yet the world around them grew darker. Revolution hardened into civil war. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and declared a new order. For the Romanovs, the shadows of Rasputin's prophecy stretched ever longer. By the summer of 1918, the family was moved deep into the Ural Mountains, to the city of Yekaterinburg. Their new prison was the Ipatiev House, grimly renamed the House of Special Purpose. Guarded day and night by Bolshevik soldiers, the Romanovs lived in fear, stripped of their jewels, their crowns, their freedom. Yet, even in captivity, there was dignity. Alexandra stitched clothes for her children. The daughters, once draped in pearls, now scrubbed floors. Nicholas chopped wood, his once delicate hands blistered and calloused. Still, rumors spread that loyal monarchists were advancing, that armies might free them. In Moscow, Lenin and his comrades feared that the Romanovs could become a symbol, a rallying cry for their enemies. A decision was made, grim and final. The dynasty must be erased. Root and branch, the night of July 16, 1918, settled heavy upon the Ipatiev house. Outside, the streets of Yekaterinburg were quiet, but in the cellar of that house, history prepared to drown itself in blood. The Romanovs had said their prayers, kissed one another goodnight, and retreated to their dreams, unaware that the end was already walking toward them. It began with a summons. The guards awakened the family near midnight. Nicholas, pale but calm, dressed quickly. Alexandra followed, leaning heavily on her cane, her body weakened by years of stress and illness. The children, confused but obedient, were told to gather together. Alexei, too frail to walk, was carried down by his father. They were led into a small, dimly lit basement room. Whitewashed walls, a single hanging bulb. The smell of dust and lime. Nicholas looked at the faces of the guards and understood. For a moment, silence hung like a blade in the air. Then, the command was given. The room erupted in thunder. Bullets tore through flesh and bone. The daughters screamed, clutching at one another. Alexandra gasped, collapsing beside her son. Nicholas fell in an instant, the last Tsar of Russia silenced forever. Yet the children did not die easily. Jewels sewn into their corsets, as secret treasures, deflected bullets like armor. Bayonets were thrust into the room, hacking and stabbing until the screams faded to nothing. The Romanovs lay lifeless on the cellar floor, their blood pooling across the tiles. Their bodies, mutilated, were loaded into carts and driven to the forests outside the city. There, they were burned, hacked apart, and buried in secret graves. The Bolsheviks hoped that the world would never know the truth of what had happened in the House of Special Purpose. But history does not stay buried. Whispers carried the horror across Russia and across the world. The dynasty was no more. But in death, the Romanovs were transformed from rulers into martyrs, from flesh into legend. The curse of Rasputin had been fulfilled. The empire had traded its crown for blood, and the echoes of that night in 1918 would haunt Russia for generations. The cellar was silent again, yet the shadows did not lift. In the silence, the Romanovs lingered an echo, a curse, a family whose ghosts refused to rest. The Romanovs had been shot, bayoneted, and buried in shallow graves beneath the cold Ural soil. But death did not silence them. Instead, the slaughter of July 1918 created an echo that stretched across the 20th century, a whisper of blood and betrayal that clung to Russia like a shroud. The Bolsheviks had believed that, by killing the family, they would erase them, obliterate not only their bodies, but also their memory. Yet secrecy breeds legend. The Romanovs vanished into rumor. In Petrograd and Moscow, people whispered that the Tsar and his family had been moved elsewhere, spirited away to another country. Some believed they still lived, hidden under false names, waiting for the day when Russia would call them back. Others told darker tales that their souls had cursed the land, that the red banners of revolution were already stained with their vengeance. In truth, the bodies lay broken in the forest outside Yekaterinburg. Soldiers had tried to destroy them, burning what they could with acid, hacking away at bone, burying the fragments in unmarked pits. But they could not hide the crime forever. Bones have a way of rising again, of demanding remembrance. The Bolsheviks, however, needed silence. They announced only the death of Nicholas, claiming that Alexandra and the children had been moved. The lie was clumsy, but it served its purpose. In the chaos of civil war, truth was a luxury no one could afford. The White Army monarchist forces still fighting against Lenin's Reds advanced toward Yekaterinburg only days after the murders. They searched desperately for survivors, for a living heir. They found instead a house stripped bare, its cellar floors scrubbed of blood, its walls hiding bullet scars. The ghosts lingered, but the bodies were gone. The White Army set up investigations. They collected testimonies from locals, whispers from guards who had spoken too much. Slowly, the horror of that night unfolded. The shots, the screams, the bayonets, but with no bodies to show, the story became a myth, half true, half shadow. And in that vacuum of proof, legends grew. The most haunting of those legends was Anastasia. The youngest daughter, spirited and mischievous, had captured imaginations, even in life. After the murders, rumors spread that she had survived. Some said she had been shielded by her corset of jewels, others that a sympathetic guard had smuggled her away into the night. Across Europe, women appeared, claiming to be the lost princess. The most famous was Anna Anderson, a troubled woman who surfaced in Berlin in the 1920s. She bore scars. She told stories of the Romanov household. And for decades, she convinced some that she was indeed Anastasia. Her case dragged through courts and families, her identity questioned again and again. She became a ghost of history, a living riddle born of violence and lies. But whether Anastasia survived or not, the truth of the Romanovs was already set in blood. The family was gone, yet their presence haunted Russia. For Lenin and his comrades, the murders were both a triumph and a burden. They had killed a dynasty, severed the roots of monarchy, and yet in doing so, they had created martyrs. The Romanovs became a symbol for the enemies of Bolshevism, a rallying cry that whispered of innocents slaughtered as years turned into decades. Russia transformed into the Soviet Union. Palaces became museums. Churches were desecrated, their bells silenced, their icons smashed. The country of the Tsars became a country of workers and commissars, but beneath the red banners, the memory of the Romanovs lingered. In secret, people lit candles for them. In whispers, they prayed to them. The Bolsheviks had turned them into shadows, but shadows are difficult to control. In exile, surviving relatives of the Romanov dynasty scattered across Europe, cousins, aunts, and distant princes. They lived in poverty, stripped of wealth, stripped of home. Once the Romanovs had ruled over 1/6 of the earth's land. Now, their descendants struggled to pay for rent in Paris or Berlin. Some longed to return, others abandoned the dream entirely. Yet in their exile, the legend of their slaughter only grew. For the Soviet state, the bodies remained a problem. The graves in the forest of Yekaterinburg were known to a few, but officially, they did not exist. The secret was buried so deeply that even high-ranking officials did not always know the truth. Decades passed. Stalin rose, ruled, and died. The empire of the Bolsheviks hardened into tyranny, and still, the ghosts of the Romanovs waited beneath the earth. It was not until the 1970s that their bones stirred again. Local researchers, working quietly, discovered the burial site. They uncovered skeletons scarred with bullet holes, shards of bone, pieces of clothing. They knew they had found the Romanovs. But in the Soviet Union of that time, to speak of such things was dangerous. The truth was once again hidden, the site kept secret until the collapse of the Soviet regime itself. When the Soviet Union crumbled in the early 1990s, the graves finally opened. Forensic teams examined the remains. Scientists matched DNA with living relatives, proving beyond doubt that these were the Romanovs. The mystery of Anastasia was solved at last. She had died with her family, her bones lying among theirs. Anna Anderson was nothing but an imposter. Her identity another chapter of sorrow written upon the Romanov name. In 1998, 80 years after their execution, the Romanovs were given a funeral fit for royalty. Their bones, cleaned of the soil and blood, were carried through the streets of St. Petersburg. Bells rang once more in the city of the Tsar, in the Peter and Paul fortress, where centuries of Romanov rulers had been laid to rest. Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were buried. Russia, reborn from revolution, stood awkwardly before its past, torn between reverence and guilt. Yet even that burial was incomplete. 2 of the children, Maria and Alexei, remained missing, their bones still hidden in the forest. Their absence fed the curse, the lingering sense that the Romanovs could never truly rest. It was not until 2007 that their remains were found and confirmed. And still, arguments lingered within the Russian church. Hesitant to sanctify bones touched by such secrecy and violence, the Romanovs, in time, were canonized as martyrs by the Russian Orthodox Church. No longer merely rulers, they became holy figures, their suffering transformed into sainthood. Icons painted their faces. Pilgrims lit candles in their memory. The cellar of the Ipatiev house, once a place of screams, was torn down in the Soviet era, but later replaced by a towering church. The church on the blood. Every stone, every altar, whispered the story of that July night. But their curse did not fade. For Russia, the Romanovs became a mirror of its own history, a dynasty too blind to change, a people too desperate to wait, a revolution too cruel to forgive. Their deaths had ended an empire, yet also unleashed a century of turmoil. From Lenin to Stalin, from purges to gulags, from famine to war, the Soviet experiment carried with it the stain of blood spilled in Yek. Some say that Russia has never escaped that curse, that every upheaval since carries the shadow of the cellar, and beyond Russia, the world itself remembered. The story of the Romanovs became a legend, retold in books, in films, in whispered fairy tales of lost princesses, their faces innocent daughters, a fragile boy. A weary Tsar and Serena became symbols of a vanished age, the last gasp of empire before the modern world devoured it. History is not kind, and yet the Romanovs endure. Their bones may lie beneath stone and earth, but their ghosts remain restless. The house of special purpose may be gone, but the echoes of gunfire still linger in the Russian night. The jewels sewn into corsets, the prayers whispered by frightened lips, the betrayal sealed with bullet saw. These fragments remain like shards of glass buried in the soil of history. The curse of the Romanov family is not merely the curse of their death, it is the curse of memory, the curse of blood, the curse of a nation that could never decide whether to revere them or despise them. The dynasty ended in 1918, but their story never truly ended. In the silence of the forest, in the shadows of the Peter and Paul fortress, in the candles burning before their icons, the Romanovs still speak. They speak of innocence and arrogance, of love and despair, of a world that collapsed into revolution and murder. They speak of a curse that outlived them, a curse written in fire and blood. And so, the cellar remains, not in wood or stone, but in memory. A cellar of shadows where a royal family waits forever, their screams echoing through Russian history, their ghosts never